Okay. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. Share. Okay. Let's see. How do I? Alrighty. And I am going to, can you see the Zoom chat? You know what? I'll put it in
Yeah,
Facebook.
yes. No,
Oh, you
send it to
can.
me in the
Okay.
Zoom chat because I've got to change profiles in Facebook to put
Okay.
on
Hold
North
on.
Omaha.
Hold on. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Chat. There we go.
Oh, there we go. All right. Just a second.
So if you happen to be watching this, Adam is grabbing the link for this live stream and I'm just going to put it on social media. So give us a second there. And what we're doing is we're going to record three audio podcasts for the North Omaha History podcast, three episodes, I meant to say. And we'll release that over about the next month or so. And how we do that is we do it via Zoom. I record all my podcasts via Zoom, even if they're just audio podcasts. It's nice to see the other person, and Adam and I thought, well, gee, let's put up a YouTube channel so we can live stream it. So how you doing there? You still working on it?
Yeah, just one more second.
Okay, all righty. So as we record this, it's Monday, May 18th, and we got more weather moving through. Said it was going to spin up after 3 o'clock. So
All
we'll see.
right. I've shared it on the North Omaha History page and on Omaha History Club. So they'll come in by the dozens any second now.
There you go. Okay, and I am going to record it. Record to this computer. And yeah, okay. So the first one is Malcolm X speaking in Omaha. In 1964, Malcolm X, native of Omaha, gave a speech called A Warning to White America. And in this episode, we're going to talk about that speech, including what happened before and after, and how Omaha received it, and what happened because of it. Take it away, Adam.
Steve, what a vital and vibrant time. 1964, kind of a centerpiece in all of American history for a lot of reasons. But to really put some context to it, we got to jump way back. Let's go all the way back to 1925. In 1925 in Omaha, there was all kinds of things happening. You know, people will talk about it as kind of being the golden decade where there was so much opulence and fancy stuff. You know, the Great Gatsby kind of in Omaha. The Joslin Castle was hopping with royal good times, and there was all the big theaters in downtown Omaha, and just all of these kinds of signs of opulence and success in the city. But in reality, there was a lot more going on at the same time. African Americans were building up all of the North 24th Street corridor into a successful place for culture and business where Black people owned businesses, they had successful lifestyles, all kinds of things were happening. And not just around 24th Street, the whole North Side neighborhood, from Webster Street all the way up to Lake Street, was really vibrant and vital place. There were also Jewish immigrants and Scandinavians, a variety of white people of all kinds from all over Europe who were living throughout that neighborhood. One of the people who was living over towards 34th and Pinckney, that was an area that became known as Plum Nelly, as in that's Plum Nelly out of town. It was over by Adams Park. It was a really discreet, almost hidden black neighborhood west of 30th Street, which was pretty rare back then. But there was a family living there by the last name of the Littles. The parents were Earl Little, a Baptist minister, and his wife Louisa Little. Earl and Louisa were organizers for a national organization called the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. UNIA was founded by Marcus Garvey and was this radical black organization that really fostered a sense of Afrocentricity and the ability of black people to change their own lives. Real black power stuff for 1925. But that year, Louisa gave birth to a son. And when that son was born, his dad was excited and in his activism, the father's activism, Earl Little's activism, he used to stand on a soapbox, a literal soapbox at 24th and Lake and preach to the crowds as they walked by about black sovereignty and the ability of black people to change their own lives in America. And very powerful voice. That baby was born Malcolm Little. And little Malcolm was really young, just about a year, when a group of men showed up on horseback at his home. The father, Earl, was out of town on business, but the mother, Louisa, was there, and she came out to that front door. And from Malcolm's own story, he said that this group of riders came up and threw Molotov cocktails and rocks at the house, and Louisa came out the front door and screamed at this group of men. And they said, "You better get out of the town, or we're going to burn you down." And within a year, Louisa and her husband and her children, including baby Malcolm, moved from Omaha. They went up to Detroit, and eventually young Malcolm became known as Malcolm X. Malcolm X became one of the greatest civil rights leaders in American history, one of the greatest advocates, one of the greatest public speakers ever in America. And really, his power and potential was maximized after time in prison, after being a criminal, after doing all that, when he joined the Nation of Islam. And under the direction of the Nation of Islam and its leader, Malcolm X rose to prominence. He was a dynamic powerhouse speaker, but he wasn't born in a vacuum. Omaha was already a place for civil rights in 1925 when he was born. There were all kinds of organizations that were active and activating, and all kinds of leaders who were doing wonderful and powerful things. His family left early, but the UNIA's legacy in the city didn't end. By 1964, the civil rights movement had gained steam nationally. 1954, it went national under Dr. King's movement, um, with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and really went to the forefront with stories like the Greensboro sit-ins, the um, a whole variety of events, the Birmingham boycott and whatnot. But simultaneously, in Omaha, the civil rights movement never really died down from the 1920s, even earlier than that. In the 1940s, there was a group called the DePores Club that were born at Creighton University, Steve, your uh, alma mater. And the DePores Club stepped into that legacy in 1948 before the national movement. There was a bus boycott that happened in Omaha in the early 50s. I've written about that on NorthOmahaHistory.com. But it gained steam and things kept changing and moving around. And eventually, Omaha saw the formation of a group called 4CL, the Concerned Citizens Committee for Civil Liberties. And 4CL was led by two Baptist ministers in Omaha, Reverend McNair and another Reverend, and they basically worked together to create all this change. In 1964, these gentlemen were responsible for bringing in this national civil rights leader, this powerhouse known as Malcolm X. In 1964, Omaha's race scene was tense. Jim Crow hadn't died away in Omaha, and if anything, it was even strong in 1964. But all of the energy of that national movement and all the things that 4CL had already done in Omaha laid a foundation for Malcolm to come in and really raise the bar, bring it to the next level. When he arrived, it wasn't by accident. So originally in May of 1964, a reporter at the Omaha Star, Omaha's black newspaper at that point, still is today, the Omaha Star's reporter was a man named Charles Washington. You might be familiar with the Charles Washington Branch Library on 29th and Ames in North Omaha. It's named in Charles Washington's honor. Charles Washington was a very powerful advocate for North Omaha and for African Americans in the city, and his legacy is still remembered in that library and a couple other ways around the city. But Washington actually went to visit Malcolm X after he returned from the Hajj. You see, Malcolm X didn't stay in the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X eventually went to Mecca and did a Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca called the Hajj and converted from being a black Muslim to being a Muslim and practicing Islam as his religion. He changed his name. From his birth name of Malcolm Little, he became Malcolm X, like so many white people know and still refer to him today. But then in 1964, he changed his name again from Malcolm X to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. And El Shabazz became the leader that he was in that moment after he did his Hajj to Mecca. He had a spiritual awakening and he really saw the need to move beyond the racial dynamics that he had proponented for so many years as a black Muslim. And he saw the need to build unity and build solidarity, even with white people who were down for the movement of freeing people from oppression. So, Charles Washington went to Detroit, or I'm sorry, went to Chicago to meet El Shabazz after he returned from Mecca. And when he got there, El Shabazz told Charles Washington that he had a good dose of Omaha before he was even born. He knew that he had his legacy in the city and that he actually wanted to go back to Omaha. He told the story in the newspaper in the Omaha Star in May of 1964. He told the story of how his family was burned out of Omaha and how when he was in Africa, he was shown a historic photo from 1919. Now remember, he was in Africa before 1964, but still around that time. And he was showing a photo of people from when he was in Ghana who showed him a picture of the lynching of Will Brown. There's this horrific photo that shows Will Brown being burned while this mob of white people stand around him smiling in downtown Omaha in 1919. Malcolm X said that that jarred him and it jolted him to a new awareness, uh, to where he understood that legacy of where he came from and his home city. Speaking about it when he was in Ghana, he said, when they want to show how the Negro is treated in America, they show this scene, referring to that photo of Will Brown. So you could see how that really became burned into his imagination in the worst kind of ways. In his first major address after he got back from Mecca in June of 1964, Malcolm X spoke about founding the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or the OAAU. And that's when he connected with the Citizens Committee for Civil Liberties, or 4CL, in Omaha. Charles Washington's interview and that connection brought him to Omaha. Reverend Kelsey Jones was the other minister who was leading the 4CL at that point with Reverend Rudy McNair. And Kelsey Jones made an announcement in late June of 1964 where he announced at Zion Baptist Church near 24th and Grant Street, still stands there right now, he announced that Malcolm X would be coming to Omaha. The subject of his presentation was going to be called A Warning to White America, and it was time. Kelsey Jones, when asked by the Omaha World Herald why they were bringing him in, Kelsey Jones said, Malcolm has a message that should be heard. He said, if Omaha can back Goldwater, it ought to be able to stand for Malcolm for one day. Barry Goldwater was supported by a lot of conservatives in Omaha. And Kelsey Jones called him out and said, hey, if you got a big enough heart to like this racist bigot, you can have a big enough heart to at least listen to Malcolm for one day. And so during his announcement, Reverend Jones also said that this isn't, we're not trying to paint a scary picture. Uh, it might just indicate the direction of where our civil rights movement might go. So the World Herald interviewed Reverend Jones and later on said um, that Jones shared a story about how when he and his colleagues were traveling down to Kansas City once, they stopped in Nebraska City. That year in 1964, they stopped in Nebraska City to eat at a restaurant, and the group was told that they could buy food and drink that would have to leave the restaurant, but they couldn't sit there to eat it. Now, this was already after the DePores Club had protested segregation at a downtown lunch counter underneath the Douglas County Courthouse, and they won integration there. This was already after the 4CL had brought 10,000 protesters to the Omaha City Hall to stop City Hall from continuing Jim Crow rules around the city. So the civil rights movement was in Omaha was already powerful, was already moving. Things were already beginning to change. But when El Shabazz showed up in June of 1964, he met 400 people at the Omaha Civic Auditorium, cheering and screaming and applauding for him. El Shabazz was introduced by Reverend McNair and Reverend Jones. There were uniformed cops all around the building, and there were plainclothes policemen who sat in the audience. Rumor has it, and not even rumor, but actual Freedom of Information Act requests have shown that FBI agents were placed strategically throughout Omaha in order to track the life of Malcolm X when he got to Omaha. So all of the things were lined up. The Omaha Store uh, put out a front page feature about Malcolm's visit. And the headline said, Negro must prepare to defend himself or continue at the mercy of racist mobs. When Malcolm X spoke, the Omaha Star reported that a colorful, controversial Malcolm X declared here on Tuesday night that the history of unpunished violence against Afro Americans clearly indicates they must be prepared to defend themselves or continue to be defenseless people at the mercy of a ruthless and violent racist mob. And when he said that, El Shabazz was speaking directly about Omaha and its treatment of Will Brown in 1919. But he was also talking about the police brutality that was typical in the city up to that point, as well as nationwide. In my experience, lots of white Omahans like to say that, well, this was typical of the entire city and the entire country, and that it wasn't just Omaha. But the fact of the matter is, Malcolm X didn't come Omaha to give giant exhortations of the entire country. He was speaking directly to his experience in the city as a kid and what he knew was continuing there to that day. He said, a man in his speech, he said, a man with a rifle or a club can only be stopped by a person who defends himself with a rifle or a club. See, he was responding to Dr. King's anti-nonviolence, anti-violence movement, and really extorting Black Americans to step up and respond eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. The paper quoted him as saying, as Americans, we will not give up a single right guaranteed under the Constitution. El Shabazz said that it's the duty of every African American and every Afro American community throughout the country to protect its people against mass murderers, bombers, lynchers, floggers, brutalizers, and exploiters. Omaha had all those things, Steve. It wasn't rare for this. It was actually part of a big pattern. And in my work on NorthOmahaHistory.com, I've been tracing that pattern now for more than 15 years. Answering a recent demand from President Johnson to Americans to strike back if her peace and security were jeopardized, Malcolm X said, how do they expect that we will strike back for peace and security in Korea, Laos, and Vietnam and not strike back for peace and security in Mississippi? How do they expect us to be violent in Laos and peaceful in Florida? There was some rioting in 1964 that had happened in Florida, and Dr. King had actually gone down there, and that repulsed Malcolm X because Malcolm X believed that those Floridians needed to get violent in response. In the days before the town forum in Omaha, Dr. King had really faced that violence head on. And I'm a proponent of that nonviolence, but I think the important part is to understand that Malcolm X was not. He said he wanted to, quote, organize our people into self-defense units capable of retaliating against the KKK in the only language it understands. The day for turning the other cheek to those inhumane brute beasts is long over. King ended up maintaining his nonviolent stance, though, and big changes happened in St. Augustine because of what they did, including the national outrage that eventually pushed for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Now, we know that that Civil Rights Act, most parts of it were recently overturned right now in 2026 by the United States Supreme Court. But regardless, back then, this was the real public conversation that was happening between King and Malcolm X, El Shabazz. The Omaha Star ended its reporting on Shabazz's speech by saying that El Shabazz warned that a real and honest effort to remove the just grievances of 22 million Afro Americans must be made immediately, or in short, while it will be too late, or in a short while it'll be too late. But that wasn't the only coverage, Steve. See, the Omaha Star, while it was the newspaper for the black community, and well, some well-meaning white people read it, the main media for Omaha in 1964, the stations were rising, but the Omaha World Herald was still at the front of the pack. And given Malcolm X's stature, the World Herald had to report on it. But believe it or not, they had a different angle. And so instead of saying, hey, here's all the great things and here's all the possibility and here's the strong message that X is bringing, the World Herald centered their reporting on some select quotes. They quoted El Shabazz as saying, anything whites can do, we can do better than you, referring to black people. They also concentrated their coverage on him mentioning Ghana and Mao Zedong. In their lead for the story, they quoted him as saying, America is the country of the past and Africa is the country of the future. See, the World Herald refused to refer to El Shabazz by his chosen name and instead almost exclusively referred to him as Malcolm X. It was also a lot less comprehensive in its coverage. They quoted a lot more salacious things than what the Omaha Star had. They quoted Malcolm X as saying, we have a racist government in Washington that has the audacity to tell us that the South lost the Civil War. They quoted him as saying, the sins of the fathers are about to be visited on the heads of their children of this generation. They quoted him as saying, we 22 million Afro Americans must form a united front. There's no reason for us to be divided. We do not want integration. We want complete recognition and respect as human beings. They also quoted him as saying the United States government has failed to give us our freedom in our pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We will not be denied much longer. All of that El Shabazz said in Omaha in that speech in 1964. I mean, Steve, this is powerful stuff that to this day the United States is still reconciling with. Early in his talk, he wasn't saying the South just won. He's saying that the federal government allowed Southern style racism, including Jim Crow and lynching, to continue to dominate the entire country to that day in 1964. A lot of people still say it's happening right now. Omaha's most famous son led a Q&A session after he was done. The questions, they centered on white hypocrisy, on the religion of El Shabazz of Islam, on capitalism, violence. Just 2 days after he talked, on June 30th, 1964, 2 days after that, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And while the nation was getting ready to celebrate that legislative victory, Malcolm X was warning Omaha that without self-defense and human rights, legislation was just paper. Now, you and I could guess this, and I bet you've already jumped there, Steve, in your imagination, but the reality is there was so much backlash against his appearance. Oh man, those op-ed papers in the World Herald lit up for the next couple weeks. One letter writer said that his speech was a big disappointment filled with conceit and remarks of a communistic nature. And another one wrote that Malcolm X is an anarchist who advocates the overthrow of the government. 2 days later, another letter writer demanded that the Reverends McNair and Jones owe to Omaha an apology for inviting El-Shabazz to speak. It'd be just as ridiculous for a couple of white ministers to invite a Nazi white supremacist for a speech, when in reality, Barry Goldwater came to Omaha and was celebrated as a hero by a lot more than 400 people. In 1992, Bertha Calloway, the founder of the Omaha Great Plains Black History Museum, she said that Omahans didn't give a darn about Malcolm. They hated him. And from the comments that I read in the newspaper, that was all true. There were no comments of support. There was nobody was jumping up and down saying, go Malcolm X. It just wasn't happening. Now, a couple of interesting things were reported long after the visit. Remember, that was 64. In 1992, Ernie Chambers told the Lincoln Journal-Star that he spent about 6 hours with Malcolm that day. Chambers was 26 years old, and Malcolm had less than a year to live. So it's no surprise to anybody who's ever read anything or seen Ernie Chambers speak. It's no surprise that Chambers traced his lineage to Malcolm X and even before him. He soaked up every minute that he could of El-Shabazz's visit to the city. Charles Washington's advocacy on behalf of the memory of El-Shabazz continued after he died. A wonderful community organizer named Rowena Moore uh, worked for a very long time to establish the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation. And Charles Washington was involved in the creation of that foundation as well as other things to memorialize. And Washington ended up saying eventually that he was, quote, the most dedicated person that has walked the streets of the world. So beautiful legacy in Omaha. Today, the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation is really carrying the legacy of Malcolm X throughout the city. I've written articles on the history of Malcolm X's life when he was a kid in Omaha. I've written about the different commemorations and celebrations that have tried to happen over the decades for Malcolm X. But the fact of the matter is, today, right now, there are no streets in Omaha named for its most famous son. There are no schools named in honor of his work or of himself. There are no commemorations officially by the city of Omaha for Malcolm X, El-Shabazz, Malcolm Little, a kid who was born in North Omaha. It just hasn't happened. In the early 2000s, El-Shabazz was nominated a whole bunch of times for recognition in the Nebraska state capitol, but that media bias and those political discriminations and Jim Crow in Nebraska kept it away from him, that recognition, for more than 60 years. Until 2022, when the Nebraska Hall of Fame Commission voted 4-3. He almost lost yet again. But in 2022, he was selected as the 27th member of the Nebraska Hall of Fame. It was a historic moment. In 2024, a formal induction ceremony happened at the Nebraska State Capitol in Lincoln with a bronze bust and that honor placed on him. 1984, the National Park Service listed the Malcolm X Memorial birthplace in North Omaha on the National Register of Historic Places, and the state of Nebraska erected a marker there. But again, today, no schools, no streets, no parks, no nothing in North Omaha are named for him. And apparently, there's no will for that to change by the city, by political leaders, and even by community leaders. Maybe someday Omaha will step up and properly recognize El Haj Malik El-Shabazz. But until then, I share a little bit of this history and that day when he spoke in Omaha on June 30th, 1964. You can learn more at northomahahistory.com.
Okay. Alrighty.
It was
And
pretty cool. The executive director of the foundation, she actually sent me a note on Instagram and said that she learned something that she never had. And then Malcolm X scholar out of Detroit actually sent me several emails to applaud me for that article on that speech because he never knew the details. He'd seen a little bit. He also said I gave the most fair reporting that he had ever read about Malcolm X in history, ever. And this guy's a scholar. Like he's read hundreds and hundreds of articles and books. So that's pretty cool.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Touring the Kiner block. And I'm saying that correctly, Kiner?
You are. Yep.
Okay. Okay. For 90 years, a huge mixed use commercial and apartment block on North 16th Street was an anchor in a busy neighborhood. This story explores who lived there, the small storefront businesses that rotated through it, and how sadly it eventually met the wrecking ball. Adam?
Steve, imagine North Omaha. When we talk about it today, it sounds like it's just one big blob. One place that everybody always saw all the time as the same thing. Whether you were talking about 16th and Cumming or 24th and Ames or 30th and Tucker Street or 42nd and Grand or any of these other points around the community, everybody always talks about North Omaha like it's one big thing, one big place. The reality, though, is that North Omaha is a community that's made of a patchwork quilt of neighborhoods. And for all of my research and for all the time that I've been doing this research and education and advocacy, I've been trying to show people this isn't just one big blob. All these little neighborhoods have their own history and their own identity. In order to be really successful, the individual neighborhoods had to have their own stuff, their own attractions, their own things that made them grow. Some neighborhoods had more than others. One of those neighborhoods was around 16th and Locust. The neighborhood around 16th and Locust never really had a single name. It was a couple different places. On the west side of 16th and Locust, you had the Kuntz Place neighborhood, a fine, upstanding suburb for its first 20 years that became integrated into the city. You had Saratoga around 24th and Ames that was up there. You had even Sulphur Springs from the olden days, from the cowboys and the wagons and the horses and all that. But by the 1920s, by the 1910s, even by the 1890s, that area around 16th and Locust was booming. It was growing up really fast. Two-story buildings, four-story buildings, even rumors of six-story buildings getting built right around 16th and Locust. There were industries up and down 16th, Steve. All kinds of big name places that we know about and talk about today. Back then, there were places like the Stores Beer Brewery down at 16th and Charles. There was the Nebraska Consolidated Mills that eventually became Conagra, that eventually was known as Mother's Best Flour. It was right down the street. You had all of the industry that was along the Beltline Railway, which was right down the hill from 14th. And Locust was actually a big overpass that went over the railroads. So you had all of this stuff. But wait, those are just industries, man. They also had apartments, huge apartment buildings. A couple of them are still standing right now. The Ernie Chambers Court, which was originally known by a different name. Ernie Chambers Court was recently sold by the Omaha Housing Authority to a private company because it's going to boom again. The Margaret apartments are right there. They're on the National Register of Historic Places. There's a really fine duplex that's right on 16th. There are other big houses on 16th. So something was happening. They had at one point, four different streetcars running up and down 16th. That's how busy it was. Most streets had one. They had four different streetcars running up and down 16th, two on each side. Something was happening. Something was going on, man. And I'll tell you, one of the secrets of the whole entire area, but especially near 16th and Locust, one block south of that, was Corby Street. You might be familiar with the old Corby Theater. It still stands as 16th and Corby. Just south of that, right across Corby Street, is a big empty lot right now. The next business that's on 16th from that, south of 16th and Corby, is a Family Dollar store. But at one point, there was a building that stood right there at 16th and Corby that covered half a block. It was 3 stories tall. It had businesses and apartments above it. And it was called the Kiner Block, Kiner. And this is a history of the Kiner Block. It all starts with a farmer whose last name was Kiner, Kiner. And Kiner owned a tract of land um, that he had bought in the 1860s. In 1878, his grandson, a man named Jonathan Kiner, was a railroad builder and a Civil War veteran who lived in Omaha. And this guy came in and he said, "Hey, I'm going to do a thing." He moved to Omaha. He built up his estate based on his grandfather's farm right there at 16th and Corby. And in this estate, he ended up developing a huge real estate portfolio. He actually had in 1878, he had $250,000 in land holdings around the city, which today is equivalent of more than $1 million. Anyway, this guy Kiner became a contractor and was one of the main developers in North Omaha. He graded the streets in the community, particularly around his neighborhood, including Sherman Avenue, which eventually became North 16th. As North 16th grew and Jonathan Kiner himself realized, oh, wait, this area is going to be booming, he ended up taking his corner right there at 16th and Corby and developing it into a dense commercial area that followed the city's northward growth. See, today we think of Omaha as growing west, 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 west. But back then they went for easy growth patterns. West back then was a bunch of hills. North was a big flat plain. There were a few ravines along the way, but between 14th Street and 32nd Street, almost the entire length from downtown Omaha all the way up to the Ponca Hills was one big flat area. When you got up around Miller Park, it became little short, smooth hills, and that's really what Florence was developed into, and the Minnelusa neighborhood. But right there at 16th and Corby, it was super flat. And this guy Kiner smoothed it all out, put in some bricks, called it streets, and blew it up. Made a lot of money. By the 1890s, early 1890s, there were streetcar lines that went along 16th all the way to the East Omaha Factory District. I'm pointing east along the Locust. You would take the streetcar from downtown Omaha all the way up to 16th and Locust, go east, and go all the way, almost all the way to the river just south of the airport, where there was a large factory district. There were six different major factories that employed hundreds of men in each one. And those people took the streetcar along 16th. There was the bustling Saratoga neighborhood that was established in the 1850s when Saratoga was an independent town based around 24th and Grand. There was the Coons Place neighborhood that I mentioned. There was a Lake School neighborhood south of 16th and Corby. There was the village of Carter Lake, the town of East Omaha, the Sherman neighborhood, all of these places building. Jonathan Kiner's wife, after he died, his wife, her name was Naomi Kiner, and she took out a building permit for a $35,000 building. That was the final chapter in the rural past of this part of North Omaha. She basically made a big old investment that changed the whole neighborhood by building the first massive structure near 16th and Locust. Of course, hers was right on the southeast corner of 16th and Corby, and it became known as the Kiner Block. 150 feet long, 85 feet deep. This building was packed. It had seven different storefronts on the front. Then the second and third floors were filled with St. Louis flat apartments. So that meant that the commercial was on bottom, the apartments were on top. The building had a flat roof line, total terracotta relief panels along the top, big old wooden bay windows hanging over the sidewalk, and all kinds of light was just pouring into the apartments, poured into the storefronts. Those seven different storefronts had all different kinds of retail operations for the next almost 90 years after it was built. Right across the street from the Corby Theater, there was also this 16th and Corby also had a really busy bank that was caddy corner to it, one of the few banks in North Omaha, and a four-story building right across the street and the other way across 16th. So all kinds of places were involved in the enrichment of this immediate neighborhood. There were worker houses right around, but there were also huge 3, 4 story houses that were worth exponentially more than the rest of Omaha, right in the Koontz Place neighborhood, right across the 16th from the Kiner building. So there was business that was built into this neighborhood. These folks needed places to shop. They wanted to spend their money. Now, the Kiner family has their own interesting history. And if you really want to learn more, you can go to northomahistory.com and learn about the family. But let's take a look at this block. Because now that you have a mental picture of this building, of its fineries, what was really going on in it? Well, it's important to know that one of the big anchors for a long time, there were a series of different grocery stores that were owned and operated right in this building, right in the Kiner building. After the Kiner family lost control of the building in around 1905, an insurance company picked it up and they ran it for several years. The Omaha Furniture and Carpet Company had sales out of the building. They ran a couple of different storefronts. There was a soft drink parlor located inside of the Kiner building during the Prohibition in the 1920s, where a guy whose last name was Larson was licensed to sell carbonated water and near beer uh, in an operation that was meant to circumnavigate those dry laws from back then. No alcohol, so you had to sell soda and whatnot. And I put those in air quotes because in reality they were still selling booze. It was just under a different name. The Storrs Brewery was just a mile south of the Kiner block. And in 1933, the new anchor of the block, after Prohibition ended, became the Storrs Beer Tavern. They had the corner of the block. And basically, they were one of the tide taverns that the Storrs Brewery owned around Omaha to sell their beer exclusively. For more than 15 years, there was a van and storage company that kept an office in the building where they did their booking and whatnot. And in 1951, Max I. Walker's Cleaners moved in. They stayed until 63 when they built a new structure just a block away. So it was a really popular place. I'd be remiss not to mention Mrs. Madalena. That's my terrible Italian accent. Please forgive it. Mrs. Madalena sold gelato and other niche Italian stuff from a storefront, including spumoni and all kinds of Italian foods. Because 16th and Corby wasn't far from North Omaha's own Little Italy that had Northern Italians, as opposed to the Little Italy that we know about in Omaha today that had Southern Italians. Anyway, there were skilled workers who kept businesses in the Kiner block, including a regional representative for an industrial firm and shoesmiths and all variety of people. One of the last businesses in the Kiner block was Paul's Grocery. Paul's Grocery opened in the late 1940s and was run by an Italian named Paul Catano. Paul Catano uh, thrived for 25, 30 years until the late 70s. But by that point, all of the region around the Kiner block had flipped. White flight had hit this area really hard in the early 1960s, and the neighborhood became more and more exclusively African American over the next decade after that. In 1978, after the passage of the Fair Housing Act and after all these businesses had flipped, there was a big old fire, and the fire burnt down the building. All of the apartments that were on the floors above the businesses were gone. Now, it took almost the entire life of the building to become integrated, and Black people were actively excluded from living there all the way into the early 1960s. But after they couldn't be discriminated against anymore, they moved in and they saw the end of the building. The year was 1978 when an unknown arson burned down the building. It happened all over North Omaha in that decade. When business owners, building owners, basically property owners saw that they were underwater with regard to owning these buildings and they couldn't afford to keep them going. They couldn't afford to keep them up. And so they burned them down. And it happened more than once. Some people even suggest that some of the rioting in the 1960s was specifically to encourage the divestment of North Omaha by these white building and property owners who lived in West Omaha and didn't want to go to North Omaha anymore. Anyway, when Paul's Grocery was shut down in 1972, um, the building became more and more destitute. There was a police raid that happened in 73. There was a gambling den called the Northside Veterans Club. And basically, the police busted in, broke down the door, stole or seized pistols, rifles, cash, and charged all kinds of men there with gambling. There were other stores fronts there, including a shoe repair shop and ye old clip joint. It was a haircutting place. But the building's story ended with that arson in 78. And today, the whole corner's gone. It's vacant. It's been vacant since 1978. It is 2026 as we record this, almost 50 years. And that is how the Kiner building is indicative of the rest of the history of North Omaha. Today, the lot is for sale by the Omaha Land Bank. It's currently valued at $5,600, but they don't tell the story of the Kiner block. Nobody does. This once slam-packed North 16th Street doesn't look anything like that anymore. Maybe that'll change someday in the future. But until then, you know the history of the Kiner block. For more information, check out northomahistory.com.
Is that the slide you have behind you? Is that the
Yeah.
Kiner block? Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
crap. I should have said
Yeah.
that. Well,
Well,
yes, yes, it is.
the audio people wouldn't see it, but
Yeah,
yeah, if you're on the if you're watching the live stream, that's the Kiner block.
there it is.
It looks familiar.
Really,
Um,
that just intrigues me. I mean, yeah, right? You would have been a young man before
yeah,
it burned down,
I would have been 23. Yeah, 23 when it burned down. So, as going to Creighton and stuff, I was interested in North Omaha because we were right there, and I kind of wanted to see what was there. And I heard the stories of the riots and everything else, and interesting story. Why the first time I drove down around downtown and I hit the Hilton, I'm like, what the heck is going on here? This is stupid. And so I asked a couple of friends of mine. They said, well, they had riots in North Omaha and they wanted to, build a fort around it, so to speak, so you couldn't get up there.
right?
And Sonny Foster was president of the student government at Creighton. Do you remember Sonny?
Mm,
Sonny was Ben Nelson's campaign manager for a
mm,
number of years, and
mm,
he was president, and I can't remember the official name of it, but it was the Black Students
mm,
Association at Creighton,
mm,
and they actually had one of the neighborhood houses that were still left right across from Keywood Hall. But I asked Sonny if, yeah, you should look him up sometime.
yeah.
He passed away in 2005, but he was very integral in Ben Nelson's administration, and an
Mm,
African American.
mm,
But two stories about him. I figured, well, Sonny might know something about it, so I went and asked him, and he was very accessible to all the students because he was student government president. Nicest guy you'd ever want to meet, by the
right.
way. And he said, yeah, he says, I think it's more than the riots. He said, I think it's racism. I
Mm,
really do. That's not how you deal with the problems in North Omaha by building a fort around it. And then the other story was he was also president of the Black Students Association, and they were having a meeting in that house.
right.
And Jim Burnett, I don't know if that name rings a bell, but he was a photographer at the World Herald for years. And Jim was a couple of years ahead of me, just like Sonny. And uh, Jim's nickname was Whitey. He was as white as John McCain. I mean, this, yeah, he was, so we all called him Whitey. And I mean, he had blonde hair, he had pasty white skin. We all thought it was funny. But he shows up to take photographs there.
Right.
And it was a closed meeting. And Sonny said, uh, Whitey, I'm sorry, but I can't let you in. And then he looked at him and he said, that didn't sound right, did it? So Sonny had a great sense of humor.
Right. Right.
Yeah, Whitey, I can't let you in. So
Incredible.
yeah, look, you should look him up. He
Yeah,
was
I will.
yeah, he was a leader in the community, actually, very much so.
Separately, I mean, and this is really an invitation to anybody who might be watching, but mostly you, Steve. I do want to have a pointed conversation with you at some point about your North Omaha history memories, because you do have them. I mean, as peripheral as it might feel, you have this vivid like vision that you captured
Well,
when you
it's
were
not it's
young.
not it's not vivid anymore. This was 50 years ago.
I
So
know,
you,
but every now and then you'll drop these nuggets, and I'm not in a
yeah,
place to write
yeah,
down the
and
notes.
yeah, I'm kind of prompted to do that. I saw the Kiner block and I go, I think I remember that. That looks
Right.
very familiar. And there were buildings like that. I mean, there was up and down 16th Street by downtown. There was a number of buildings that look like that are long gone. But
Yeah, this is part of my goal. I want to find more of them. And I found a couple of the apartment buildings that have been obliterated and lots of this stuff is far outside of my memory, but it just intrigues me. It just captures my little imagination. I just want to run with it and find more.
well, the reason I probably remember the Kiner building was because of the architecture. And it was pretty
Wow.
derelict by the time I was, in school, 73, 74. So that's probably what got my attention.
Yep,
Um,
yep,
okay, well, let's get on to the birth of Duncan Hines. The
yep.
birth of Duncan Hines. Starting in the 1870s, the first wheat mill in Omaha was located on North 16th Street. For more than 125 years, it Okay. For more than 125 years, it went through changes in business and technology until it was recently closed. And this episode, Adam connects the giant, familiar Mother's Best Flour Mill landmark to surprising national history. Adam?
First thing, if you're watching on video, you know this image behind me. It's flipped around, so pretend it's in your rearview mirror. But the fact of the matter is, for a long time, those gigantic granary buildings on 16th Street, right around Charles, they had this big red neon sign on top that said "Mother's Best Flour." No, I'm no young man, but if I'm a little bit too young to actually have experienced this and seen it with my own eyes, but I've heard about it from so many people in my advocacy and learning about North Omaha's history from community members. A lot of people have mentioned this particular landmark and they wanted to know more about it. So I went down the rabbit hole and found it. And what I found blew my mind. I mean, just an absolute treasure of a building that was built with solid live oak and custom iron from one of the ancient manufacturers in Omaha, Paxton and Veerling. Its mechanical heart was a steam engine that powered super advanced machinery for its day. But it all started a very, very long time ago. And I want to dial us way back to the 1880s. In the 1880s, North 16th Street was called Sherman Ave. It was renamed for a Civil War general from the North who fought hard for the United States, and he was celebrated in Omaha in a number of different ways, including the renaming of North 16th Street. The Omaha Milling Company was the only wheat flour manufacturer when it was opened in 1880, around 1888, located at 16th and Charles. It was the first company to really capitalize on these new railroads that were building up huge yards right by 16th Street. And they really wanted to use the proximity of those trains to help churn out uh, the wheat that was being produced in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa and make a lot of money. And basically, it was late 1887 when the Omaha Milling and Elevator Company was officially opened and began operations on January 1st of 1888. They were immediately called a valuable addition to Omaha Enterprise because they were the original mill in the city and stayed that way for several years, the only mill. They had a rear entrance that connected directly to the Beltline Railway, this five-story granary that shoveled in granary from incoming trains and then moved it back out that way. There were horse-drawn wagons that came up the way. Workers came on a horse-drawn railway that went up 16th Street or 17th Street, a block away. And other industrial sites were opening nearby too. It was in 1907, so 20 years after it was opened, that the site became a cornerstone of what was a business empire in Omaha. There was a man named Nelson Updike. He was a super powerful businessman who was investing all around in Omaha at this point, between the late 1900s and the early 20th century. Nelson Updike owned a variety of things. He owned a huge lumber yard that was out on Saddle Creek Road, but he also owned what was called the Updike Milling Company. And basically, he focused on building up this one place, this one milling operation to make a lot of money. He built a new factory right on 16th. So the old mill was set back from the factory and basically turned this factory into an terminal elevator. So all these wagons would come in carrying bushels and bushels of wheat. It would get processed in the mill and then sent to the factory that made it into flour. And Updike's flour became a really popular brand for all of the Midwest. This was the very first time that agriculture was getting consolidated into industrial settings. And this was happening right in Omaha. When Updike Milling was operating the mill, Omaha climbed the ranks and became the second largest milling center in the world. Let's just take that in really quick. North Omaha, 16th and Charles, the second largest milling center in the world. It was on the eastern edge of the near north side. It was providing business or work for all kinds of workers, but it was also the basis of an industrial revolution that took the entire country and the world by storm. Now, in 1922, Updike switched up his model. He got consolidated with a bunch of other companies, and the new company was called the Nebraska Consolidated Mills. They took over in 1922. The mill had been transformed into one of the most huge agricultural facilities in all of the nation. There was not only the old mill that sat down by the train tracks and not only the old factory that sat on 16th. By then, the factory had expanded over and over. Warehousing was being built, and it covered the entire space from 16th back to the railroad. The mill itself was expanded from 5 stories to six. It was made of wood, and the Nebraska Consolidated Mills was getting bigger and bigger. Their headquarters was moved from a smaller Nebraska city into Omaha, and Omaha became the primary rail hub and grain market for not only the state, but all of the region, including Kansas and South Dakota and Iowa. In December 1931, though, they had a big old setback when that beautiful wooden mill was destroyed. There was a big old explosion. Believe it or not, grain is highly flammable in certain conditions, and this mill really took it to the next level. And with this explosion and the fire that happened, the whole mill burned down. But instead of closing up and moving on, the company, Nebraska Consolidated Mills, hired the really popular Omaha architects, Latenser and Son, to build them a new building. $150,000, which was a lot of money for 1931, was poured into this new mill. Six-floor building along the railroad tracks with new openings to the railroads and a single-story packing room to connect the brick building to the mill, along with a plant and a whole variety of other things were built on between 31 and 32. The site expanded to become this huge elevator milling complex. Trains came up from all over the Midwest, and Nebraska Consolidated Mills became next level. Incredibly competitive, called the business papers, and it was just taking off. For the next 20 some years, it became more and more popular. But it became popular on certain brands. And one of the brands started by Updike Milling in 1922 went over to Nebraska Consolidated Mills, and it was called Mother's Best Flour. Mother's Best Flour guaranteed lean, untouched ever in this kind of development had happened. By the 1950s, the brand was nationally famous. It sponsored a television show starring Hank Williams. I'm sorry, a radio show starring Hank Williams, called the Mother's Best Flour Show. And Hank Williams performed all the time from Nashville to promote Mother's Best Flour. It was a source of a lot of pride in Omaha, and people loved it. Nebraska Consolidated Mills became more and more popular. One of the interesting things that happened, though, came around in 1949. That year, the Nebraska Consolidated Mills partnered with a man, a scientist who was working at the mills. When he was working there, he developed this idea. Wait a second, we sell the flour, and we know that people are going to take that flour home and they're going to make stuff out of it. What if they could buy directly a product that would help them use the flour instantaneously instead of having to add all kinds of things and mix it together and make it go? So this man took his idea and he made a new company out of it. And this new company was named after him. His name was Duncan Hines. Duncan Hines was born in 1880, and in 1949, he was an older guy. The fact of the matter was, he was 70 when he invented this cake mix while he was working at Nebraska Consolidated Mills. For the next 6 years, 7 years, Duncan Hines was produced in partnership with Nebraska Consolidated Mills. And then in 1956, they sold the brand to Procter and Gamble, and Duncan Hines grew even further. But it was started right there in North Omaha. In 1971, Nebraska Consolidated Mills decided to change their name. That decision was made at the North Omaha Mill. They had other offices in Omaha, they had other offices around the state. But one of the things that Nebraska does not like to say out loud is that Nebraska Consolidated Mills, when they changed their name, they made the decision literally at North Omaha, in North Omaha. They changed their name to ConAgra. The next year, ConAgra bought the building next door, which was the big old former Storrs Brewery. That's right. They bought the Storrs Brewery. And they considered it a great buy because they wanted to move some of the company's processes into the building, but they didn't have immediate plans and they didn't actually end up using it. In 1973, there was a big old fire at the ConAgra mill, but it was stopped and the building kept producing. There were other major brands that came through the mill and other things were attached to it. Of course, ConAgra grew and grew and eventually built their controversial waterfront, their riverfront campus in Omaha, and eventually moved out of Omaha altogether. But all the same, the mill kept standing. In 2014, ConAgra joined together with Cargill, another big manufacturer, and they used the North Omaha mill for a number of years. In 2025, there was a company called Ardent Mills that was running the mill when they announced just last year that they were going to close the mill forever. So from its early start in 1888 all the way through 2025, the elevator, the mills, and the factory on North 16th Street, right around 16th and Charles, has stood as a titan of North Omaha manufacturing and has stayed that way despite the looks. Today, the future of that building is unknown. Lots of people have some ideas, but nobody knows for sure exactly what's going to happen next. I think it's important that we recognize the historical value of the building and the role that it's had, not only in growing North Omaha, but in growing the entire city, the entire state, and even all of the United States of America. If you want to learn more details, I have timelines and all variety of different brands and things that have been associated. And you can check it out all on northomahahistory.com. My name's Adam Fletcher Sassy. Thanks and have a great day.
I in the chat, I put the congressional record that Ben Nelson read about Sonny Foster. It's like a
There we go.
eulogy,
Yep.
and I'll tell you a little bit about him. Okay, much has been made about Sonny's firsts. He was the first African American elected as student body president at Creighton in 1973, first African American elected to the Omaha Board of Education by district, first African American to run a statewide campaign in Nebraska, had a long and distinguished career in public service. He was a legislative aide for John Kavanaugh, who was considered like the next John Kennedy when I was in college.
Hmm.
And then he just got tired of all the BS in Congress and came back and still to this day just runs his law firm. But he was a big deal in the Democratic Party when I was in college.
Hmm.
I mean, we saw him as being the next John Kennedy. Really, seriously. I mean, that's what people are saying, whether it be hype or not. That's what people are
That's
saying.
cool. Wow.
He was deputy labor commissioner for Governor Bob Kerrey, and yeah. So anyhow, I sent you that
Yeah. Yeah, I'll
congressional
study
good
this.
good guy, and he'd relate to anybody. I mean, he stood. In the eulogy, it said he didn't suffer fools gladly. I mean, he stood on his principles, and I never saw. I always thought he was just a super nice guy, always very, very gracious. But I guess he could be, he could be less than patient at times. So yeah,
Hmm. Cool, cool.
yeah,
Well, I'll definitely read that. Maybe there's an article here. Easy peasy.
I don't know. I don't know. It's
Good.
just I thought highly of
Yeah,
him,
yeah.
and he passed away in his 50s. Otherwise, he'd probably know about him. So
Keep going. Huh. That's awesome. Yeah,
okay,
I'll totally look them up. Very fun. All right, Steve. Oh, this is a good one.
yep. And I'm going to stop recording. And yep, I'm going to turn that off.